Hello, everybody. Thanks to those who joined early. We'll get started in just a few seconds. Awesome. All right. So we can get started. Thank you for joining. We have a jam-packed session today. I am your host, Crystal, and before I hand it over to our speaker, there are a few housekeeping notes to cover. So first, the session is recorded, and you'll receive the recording within 24 hours post-event via email. If you don't see that email, please feel free to reach out to webinars@criticalstart.com, and I'll be happy to assist you. Next, we will have polls throughout the session, so be sure to submit your answer when those are launched. We also want this to be as interactive as possible, so please use the chat to engage with us. We love to hear your questions and comments. Last but not least, we're giving away Amazon gift cards to 2 lucky attendees today. To enter the drawing, simply answer poll questions or ask a question in the chat. All right. And just to quickly go over our agenda today, our speakers will go over the history of ransomware, the trends and the TTP evolution, the key vulnerabilities exploited by actors, share some best practices for detection and response, and we'll end with a Q&A. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Tim. I think you're going first, so feel free to introduce yourself.
Yep, I think John's going to share the slides, right, John?
Yep.
I am. Here we go.
All right, let's do it. Let's intro. Look at that slide. It's beautiful. It took like 25 minutes to make. All right, next slide. All right, I love talking about myself. So my name is Tim Bandos. I've been in cybersecurity for 20 years now. I ran the cybersecurity function at DuPont Chemical Manufacturing for about 12 years. Massive environment, over 100,000 plus endpoints, OT devices, beyond. So that's really where I fell in love with cybersecurity. And then I pivoted into the cybersecurity vendor space. So I've been here for a little over 8 years now in various CISO level type roles and running security operations centers. So thank you all for joining today's webinar. John, over to you.
Hey, I'm John Delattery. I am a senior partner security solution architect at Qualys. I've been with Qualys for about 7 years now. Recently, past 2 years with the partner channel team. Prior to that, I was in the web application space as a product manager and security WAS SME as well. Prior to that, I was doing web application web application security at Raymond James. Worked for a while at the National Weather Service, worked at DIA doing forensics, and graduate from the Naval Postgraduate School after a career in the United States Navy.
Nice. Well, we like to always do a little icebreaker poll question. You guys can feel free to answer that in the chat. But if you had to explain ransomware to your grandparents in one sentence, what would it be? I would love to hear from you guys. We're gonna, continue with the presentation. I guess one thing that I would do, so if my grandparents were still alive today, my grandparents were, they used to love to crochet and knit things. And there was also this neighborhood cat that they absolutely despised. It'd kind of be like that cat infiltrating their home and stealing that crochet kit and leaving a note behind saying, hey, I'll give you back the crochet kit for a bowl of milk or something like that. So, my grandparents were not technical whatsoever at all, but that's how you'd have to almost dumb it down to that level. I don't know, John, if you have a better example, but that was actually kind of a really bad one.
No, I like that. I would probably not even try to explain it. Just tell them don't click on it.
Don't click it. That's even better advice. I like that.
Yeah, but I guess if it were my grandparents, it'd be like it's like you leave the house to go to the store and you come back and somebody changed your locks and they're in your house, and they'll give you the access back to your house, but it'll cost you.
It will cost you, and it always does. All right, next slide. Let's move right along. Let's get this going. So I love to always start our presentations and webinars about the history of whatever topic it is. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of ransomware. It actually started in the late 80s. If you even remember back then, it started off with something called the AIDS virus or Trojan. So it was called the AIDS Info Drive or PC Cyber Trojan, and it actually demanded $189. That was very specific, but it had to be sent via a PO box to Panama. And basically what it did was it encrypted files and names on C drives to make it inoperable. And I think the weird item about that particular piece of malware, that Trojan, is it only triggered after 90 reboots. So someone had to actually reboot their machine 90 times and then it would actually take off. So that was really kind of the first case of ransomware where we started out. Then we get into the kind of mid 2000s, 2004, 2005, 2006. This is where there was a resurgence of something called GP code or a CVEs, or this Trojan.ransom.a type variant. And ultimately what that did is it encrypted files with like a weak encryption, even though it says a stronger encryption, but it's a kind of a weak encryption. But these earlier versions demanded payment via prepaid cards and wire transfers. So this is kind of before the dawn of Bitcoin and digital currencies. And then we moved to military grade encryption, like CryptoLocker, spreading via compromised websites. Then in 2016, we saw Locky, and this was also kind of the rise of ransomware as a service, which is incredibly unfortunate because it allowed really anyone to kind of enter into this particular market, space. Even if you didn't know how to code a piece of ransomware, or if you didn't have the ability to infiltrate an organization, they would sell that as a part of this platform. So you almost had kind of like a SaaS-based solution here where you could deploy your own ransomware and actually, acquire Bitcoin, and you would just pay the ransomware, service operators, which is pretty insane if you think about that. Then in 2017, we have the famous or infamous, WannaCry outbreak. This was a global outbreak that exploited the Eternal Blue SMB vulnerability, if you remember that. I think that was leaked out of NSA, unfortunately, and it affected over 200,000 devices across 150 plus countries. So that was really one of the world's most massive outbreaks as it relates to ransomware. Then in 2020, 2022, we see Lockbit. We also see Colonial Pipeline attack. This is where, they're targeting OT related type organizations, manufacturing type facilities. The ransomware didn't actually infiltrate or get into, the OT side of the environment, but out of precaution, even though the enterprise organization got hit, they wanted to make sure that they shut down the OT devices. So that had a real world impact, on the Colonial Pipeline, which is really unfortunate. And now it kind of brings us to today. We have these AI-generated phishing lures becoming a lot more prevalent, for getting into organizations. And we're also seeing this triple extortion, right? Where not only are they encrypting files, but they're also stealing your files. And they're saying, pay up or I'm not going to provide, this back, or pay up and I'm not going to provide the key back for you able to decrypt your information. So a lot kind of goes into it now. It's not just, one thing where you can just get your files back or restored based on, a ransomware payment being delivered. Next slide, please. This is also kind of the life cycle of ransomware, how they initiate the attack. It's always, here's the planning phases. How are we going to deliver this? It's going to be via email. What's our distribution method? And then once they do, they're going to get into that organization. They're going to infiltrate it. They're going to install their backdoor, their command and control, type feature. A lot of times what I've seen from investigations, during my incident response, it can either happen in a matter of minutes, it could happen in a matter of hours, or even a couple of days. I've seen scenarios where it lasts 2 to 3 days, where once they get into a company, they take their time, they set up shop. They want to make sure that they're as effective as possible in understanding the environment that they're in, and then also looking for maybe sensitive information or confidential data that they could exfiltrate so they could do that double extortion or kind of take it to that next level of triple extortion. And then they activate the encryption. Devices become inoperable, and then organizations have to make that determination. What do I do? Do I, pay up, the ransom, or do I have the ability to restore from backups? Either way, it's a very dicey situation. I don't want to get into the political, realm of, what sort of decision do you make in that sort of scenario? But unfortunately, sometimes companies have to pay up if they don't have that backup, or if it's taking too long, to restore from backup. They need to get, up and going operationally immediately. Next slide. So let's go over a couple statistics. Next slide, please. What we're seeing, I think, so, Critical Start has threat intelligence internal team, so we also compile a lot of these numbers. But what we've seen, over the past year or so is, 59% of organizations were actually hit in the last year, and that seems really high. But it's a true number. It's a factual number. You might not see all those reportings out in the wild. I think some organizations might keep it to themselves, and maybe they're not, under some sort of compliance, mechanism where they have to report it. But yeah, 59% of organizations were hit in the last year with ransomware, and then 70% of those attacks resulted in data encryption. This methodology of deploying, a piece of malware and encrypting files have become incredibly lucrative for adversaries. So that's why we're seeing these high numbers over the years, and it's only getting worse. And then we also see 32% of these attacks starting with an unpatched vulnerability. So a third of these attacks, look for a vulnerability that can be either easily exploited or there's something out in the wild that allows them to infiltrate an organization. Maybe there's an externally facing RDP server, remote desktop server that has a vulnerability that has not been patched. That's an entrance vector for an attack. It doesn't always have to, come from a phishing email or, from some other vector. They could also look for things that are vulnerable out in the wild. So what have you seen, John? I'm the one who's talking here. I typically like to talk a lot, but I'd love to hear, your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That's really fascinating, the research your organization has pulled together. And what we do know is that organizations are being attacked. But, as you alluded to, what assets are they going after? And I like this picture a lot because it reminds us that it's easy to focus on areas that are well lit. So we always think about our production servers, our customer-facing assets. And if an organization is assessing anything, hopefully it's these assets. The problem is that attackers have plenty of other options to target as well, assets outside of that street light here. And what we have found is that 31% of ransomware attacks started from unknown to organization assets. So I think we all understand that. That makes sense, right? And then 23% of these were CISA-exploitable ransomware vulnerabilities pertain to network perimeter devices. And these are not detected by snapshot or API scans. So if you have assets that are on a cloud service provider and you're leveraging an API connector to pull down software information and you're doing your inventory against that software and looking for known vulnerabilities against it, 23% of the vulnerabilities ransomware attackers are going after, you're not going to detect with an API connector alone. More importantly, 62% of non-cloud assets, what we call a laptop or workstations that are still remotely exploitable due to the various ways that the attackers, like you said, are getting their foot in the door, like those phishing emails you alluded to, or those malicious links or attachments running exploits. But more importantly, this last one, over 50% of all these ransomware attacks and these vulnerabilities are due to end of life or end of software vulnerabilities, or even unauthorized software. And whether it's unauthorized or just not supported anymore, they're attacking vulnerabilities in endpoints with applications on them that have no business being on them in the first place. And that becomes a real problem with these assets. You're not paying attention to them. You're focusing on your external facing ones, those internal ones, those endpoints, or you're not able to scan those external facing perimeter devices for the right types of vulnerabilities depending on your scanning method. And all that becomes a problem that these ransomware actors are able to exploit.
That makes sense. I mean, taking away administrative rights on end users' computers is always the goal, I think, so that you don't run into these cases where you have outdated software that's not authorized for your environment. So that's a really interesting statistic. Here's just a couple more stats. I don't know why it says top generative AI cybersecurity use cases. Clearly, Tim didn't change the title of this one, so that's on me. But just a couple of quick statistics. 97% of orgs whose data had been encrypted actually got it back. So that's, I mean, look, that's a good thing. At least, these ransomware attackers are providing, the keys to the kingdom back to those organizations. And there's a reason for that, because if they didn't do that, then, ransomware threat actors would not get paid. I think a lot of organizations would smarten up and say, I'm not going to pay this if I'm not going to get my data back. So that's why you see such a massive number there. We're also seeing 67% increase in new ransomware group formations, which once again also makes sense. When you have these ransomware as a service type platforms that make it incredibly easy for you to enter into this particular market and once again be lucrative in that particular market, that's why we're seeing this, this massive rise or uptick in new groups being formed. 58% of organizations or companies had to shut down operations after an attack, averaged around 12 hours. So, that's a pretty substantial number if you think about it. I remember even when I was working at my last company at DuPont, we had a particular server, just as an example, at a manufacturing site. If that server went down for, 1 hour, that was going to cost the business $10,000 per 1 hour, which is absolutely insane. So, when you have, sites that are shut down for 10 hours, 12 hours, or even days, you're talking about, potentially millions of dollars. And that's a lot of times why they make that justification of, hey, let's pay the ransom so we can get back up and running, from that perspective. And then 32% of companies, pay the ransom. That seems kind of high, to be honest with you, but once again, it makes sense because you have to make that business decision ultimately at the end of the day. Do I need to get back up and running, or do I need to try and rely on my disaster recovery procedures and make sure that they're still effective? And a lot of times I've seen this, working with clients and organizations, they think they have a DR plan in place or they have business continuity, process in place, but maybe they never did a tabletop exercise to make sure that it was actually effective. They go through this as a real world example and then realize, it's broken, or there's something wrong, or we can't restore from backup, and they ultimately have to pay the ransom. So that's just what's unfortunate. Next slide, please. We see this every single day almost, or if not every day, every single week. It's constantly in the news. AT&T breach linked to American Hacker Telecom, and they paid 370, K. Or if you think about United Health cyber attack response, $2.3 billion this year that attack ultimately costed that organization. That's not what they, paid in ransom, but that's, what happens or occurs from either a reputational perspective or, this was an impact to the organization. This is, how much money it costs them to get back up and running, which is really unfortunate. And then we're also seeing these critical vulnerabilities being exploited as a part of these ransomware attacks. And that's why, making sure that you have patching in place and that you're appropriately patching and prioritizing, those patches at the right level, that they're being, taken care of. A lot of times I'll see organizations, purchase a tool like Qualys, and they turn it on, they start scanning, like, we're good to go. But unfortunately, you need to kind of operationalize that process. Qualys is fantastic for identifying vulnerabilities in environment, but that's, one part of the process is then taking that intelligence from Qualys and making sure that you apply it and also, patch those devices that require. Next slide.
Yeah, we're not just scanning for the sake of scanning. If you don't take action on it,
Right.
kind of defeats the purpose. Touching on what you just talked about, yeah, they're making ransomware is making headlines, and there's this real world cost to it. So these are the top 4 from last year. Just a little bit more detail. We had Essentia. It's a St. Louis-based Catholic health system. It had been hit by ransomware that disrupted their access to electronic health records, telecommunication systems, and more. And it was they ended up having to pay 1.3 billion in, they had 1.3 billion in losses, and we don't even know if they paid the ransom or not. They never disclosed if they did. CDK Global, hit by Black Suite, reported 1 billion in losses. They did pay the $25 million ransom as well, and it was this initial attack that they had. It was followed from a second attack while they were still working to recover their systems, and so that added to the cost that they had here, and kind of shows that even while you're recovering from one attack, if you're not focused on patching your vulnerabilities and fixing those holes, you're going to get attacked again. The third one here with Change Health Group, United Health Group, you just mentioned this one. The ransom paid was 22 million. It drove their overall cost here to 2.3 billion, and 2.5 billion, and they had to resort to using paper records and processes that they had long shelved in order to kind of keep operations continuing. And the last one here, Synovus UK National Health Service, they were hit. The attack encrypted their IT systems. It forced their providers again to revert to manual and paper-based systems to process information. It exposed data for nearly 1 million different patients. The attackers stole and eventually leaked 400 gigabytes of sensitive data when Synovus did not pay the demanded $50 million ransom. And it ultimately resulted in a 33 million pound loss. And this is particularly painful for them because just a few years prior, they went through this exercise with a different ransomware group back in 2017 when they were hit. And, so this is twice in about an 8 years period that they had to deal with ransomware loss. Now, talking about repeat offenders, there is this idea of this risk of reinfection. So exploiting a vulnerability is commonly used to start a ransomware campaign. Ransomware gangs focus on the same set of vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities often stay open. It's not enough just to scan. You have to do something about it. So what we have found is that what Malwarebytes in a report they published found was that 38% of organizations fell victim to repeat ransomware attacks, just like we saw with UK health systems. And 80% of companies that paid a ransom were hit again at a later time. And 70% of these companies that paid for the second ransomware attack ended up paying a higher amount than the initial ransom. So essentially, they paid a ransom and got their services back, but before they knew it, they were hit with the same attack on the same vulnerabilities with a higher demand to get their data back.
I find that mind-blowing. So it's the reuse of the same vulnerability to come back in. So they didn't even patch that particular vulnerability. That's
I
ultimately what
guess
led to
they're,
that.
yeah, they're thinking, well, we paid the ransomware, we've got a little breathing room, but they're still open to attack. Or other attackers are probably looking there too, saying, well, as soon as they come back online, if they haven't patched it, let's hit them too. And so it just becomes a problem that if you're not focused on actually remediating these vulnerabilities, and yeah, you're dealing with a lot during a ransomware attack. But
Yeah,
also restoring your defenses has to be up the front too. Restoring the operations and those defenses so that you do not fall victim again. But
that
once
makes
good, yeah.
that
Um,
makes sense.
yeah, but why don't you tell us a little bit more about these ransomware groups? Because I think you know more than I do here.
Yeah, I mean, even just, I know this is controversial, but I feel like if you're not patching after you know about it, that's when the CISO probably should lose their job. I mean, the first time, all right, we missed it, but second time around, that's unfortunate. But yeah, we just talked about a couple of different cases, and typically, we only see maybe a handful of cases throughout the year being published in the newspapers or online in the media. But these are some of the numbers associated with the groups that have carried out, individual ransomware, campaigns. So 631 unique carried out campaigns by RansomHub, Lockbit 585, Play 350. These are all ransomware groups that were able to carry out their objectives successfully. And this is just through reportings that we're aware of. This doesn't even include numbers associated with companies that aren't reporting this. So we're talking about thousands and thousands of ransomware cases per year that ultimately these ransomware groups are being successful, which is very unfortunate. Next slide. Critical Start kind of looked at these numbers, over the second half of 2024, looking at trends, looking at upticks, and where what particular sectors were being targeted. We were seeing kind of a massive uptick in the engineering, construction space, the manufacturing space, the technology space. Those are like the three top hitters a lot of times. Professional services, I thought that was an interesting one. That's the top one. But this kind of makes sense if you look down the line. Even the automotive industry, they're also getting hit. And if you look at some of them, they're low hanging fruit, opportunistic, type targets. At my last company, we would sell to small, medium-sized businesses, like dental offices. Just an example. You wouldn't think a dental office would get targeted, but they do, because once again, it's a low hanging fruit. They don't have necessarily, best of breed type technology deployed from a security perspective. So ransomware operators, move freely and easily into those, different types of businesses, unfortunately. And if they get hit, a lot of times it can be very difficult to recover. They're not like a multi-billion dollar, Fortune 500 company or enterprise that has the funds to do that. If they have to pay out 200,000 in Bitcoin, that's a lot of money for them. So it's really just unfortunate, right, that the industry just gets hit like this. Next slide.
Yeah, and it's not just a single point of entry for these ransomware groups either, right? So it's not just a cloud or laptop issue; it's an enterprise issue. And I know you talked before about the ransomware lifecycle. And when we look at it from the Qualys perspective, we think about all these little inflection points where things could go bad. So, we call it an enterprise issue because typically it's not going to be just one solution that's going to solve your problem. It could be like number one here, there's an email attack, just a volume of emails coming in. Maybe somebody's going to click on something and number two happens. So the user clicks on and that endpoint becomes compromised, because there wasn't a good endpoint protection in place. Now, just like all these worms do, they start to proliferate through the network. They're laterally moving with privileges. They're compromising credentials, etc. They're hunting for key data, folders, and stable backups. And this is like what you mentioned before, where they're probably not encrypting right away. They're getting the lay of the land, getting their fingers into everything so that they know where they can start to execute the most control. Number four here is that command and control. So it's command and control back to the attacker, followed by the encrypting files. And this is where, people start to notice things are going bad. And then number five, they still have that lateral movement between improperly segmented networks. So this allows them to hunt for and connect to other networks that are available. And that's why you can't just focus on preventing ransomware on an endpoint like a laptop or a asset like a production server. You have to have an enterprise approach to preventing ransomware attacks.
Yeah, that's a great point, John, especially on the segmentation. I've seen cases where, contractors have come into manufacturing facilities. They've had, for example, a piece of ransomware that is able to propagate laterally on their laptop. They, plug in a USB into, for example, like an OT environment. And if you don't have micro segmentation or having that for example, programmable logical controllers being segmented properly, that ransomware is going to wreak havoc, in an OT side of the house as well. So you really got to think through, once again, that zero trust type policy and making sure that you have proper segmentation in, both your IT environments, your OT environments, depending on the type of environment that you have. This particular case here, this is just a real world example that we saw, over the last year. This was actually an engineering firm in North America where they were affected by the Black Basta ransomware. And I believe the group was called Storm 0506. But during this particular attack, the threat actor, they exploited a vulnerability, CVE 2025-37085, I believe. And then that vulnerability gained elevated privileges into the ESXi hypervisor environment. So why would you target that? Once you get into those hypervisors, you have full control and reign over not just a single device, but potentially all devices in an environment or in a segment of the environment. So they gained that initial access to the organization through an infection, a quackbot infection. They exploited that vulnerability. They elevated their privileges. They moved laterally to domain controllers. This is a common playbook that we see. Once you get on a domain controller and you execute like a Mimikatz, credential theft type program where it can inject into the LSAS memory space and carve out those credentials, you now have access to the environment to move laterally anywhere you want. As soon as you have domain admin creds, you have access and the keys to the kingdom. And then, once they're able to do that, they installed persistence, on those devices so they continue to come back. We also see a lot of times in these investigations that they tamper with, settings, Microsoft Defender settings, or they attempt to remove CrowdStrike or SentinelOne. Some technologies are better than others in terms of, not allowing that or now allowing the circumvention of those technologies, but some aren't either. I've seen full AV vendor disablement, and it allowed them to carry out the attack. So there also are a lot of ways for unfortunately disabling our endpoint protection platforms that we have installed. And then so we see this exploitation of the group, and then of course the Black Basta ransomware wins. They're able to take over the entire ESXi hypervisor. So once again, another unfortunate sort of scenario, but this is what happens in the real world. And that we're seeing in these incidents. On the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about some of these vulnerabilities too that that we've seen exploiting. You also think about software companies and even security software companies. They're prone to having vulnerabilities, entrenched within their programs. So if they're not properly being patched or updated, or they don't do safe coding practices, that could also leave your environment completely vulnerable. Avanti VPN, you leverage VPNs for security purposes, or Beyond Trust secure remote access capabilities. There was a massive vulnerability within that. Those, I think, in late 2024, where there was 2 vulnerabilities, and these flaws allowed unauthenticated command injection and post-exploitation privilege escalation capabilities for an attacker. So they could essentially execute arbitrary commands on a compromised device or system, and that just gives them full reign into that, into that environment, into that network. So these were some large scale type vulnerabilities that were being leveraged by the threat actor groups and the ransomware groups. But this is what they're targeting. They're looking for these low hanging fruits that can be easily exploited.
Yeah, what's interesting here to me is that 1, these are all patchable, and 2, they're all recent vulnerabilities. So they probably came out, not necessarily on a patch Tuesday or something, but they were all vulnerabilities that were disclosed this past year, and organizations didn't prioritize them, and they paid a price for not prioritizing the remediation of these particularly nasty vulnerabilities. I do want to talk about CISA KEVs, or known exploitable vulnerabilities associated with ransomware. So of all the CVEs that are out there, CISA KEVs, as of 2 days ago, is tracking 1,351 of them as KEVs, and 279 of these are associated with ransomware campaign use today. So when we break that down, 318 of these CVEs, these CISA KEVs, involve network and perimeter devices. And remember, I talked about, about 25% of those can't be discovered with just a snapshot or an API scan. But 100% of these have been exploited, and 72 of these are confirmed associated with ransomware attacks. And of the 853 CVs related primarily to on-premise, desktop, workstations, and laptops, that endpoint user experience there, 100% of these have recorded instances of being exploited in the wild and are associated with identified threat actors, and 164 of them, or almost 20%, are confirmed associated with ransomware attacks. All right, which brings us to our next poll question.
Ooh, how worried are you about ransomware vulnerabilities? If someone in this chat says, I'm not worried at all, my network is solid, listen, I'm going to call you on a lie on that. Like even I am slightly scared, or maybe even very scared. It kind of depends. Does it keep me up at night? No, because I think we put in the right precautions from a security perspective. I'm not the actual CISO at Critical Start. We actually have a fantastic one, George Jones. He makes sure all those things are being, appropriately safeguarded. And we spend a lot of time around, security awareness, making sure that we don't have individuals in the company clicking on links or attachments or going to shady websites. And that's important, right, from an overall security perspective. Someone said, not at all, my network is solid. I'm going to find out who that is, and we're going to have a little talk. All right, next slides.
Well, I just want to point out, think about like Caesars and MGM, the casinos, when they were hit with ransomware. The Caesar response was, they didn't pay. They recovered from backups, and MGM chose to pay because they realized they were going to lose more each day if they didn't pay. So certainly people have different approaches to how they are going to handle ransomware. So you might be worried about it, you might not, but I think the more important thing is to have that disaster recovery plan in place, to know what your risk is really going to be, and really consider what's going to happen if you have to leverage those tools in the event of a ransomware attack. So at Qualys, this is kind of exciting. I want to tell you, we have a lot of customers, and I was able to pull data on the number of vulnerabilities we detected last year that were ransomware vulnerabilities, known ransomware vulnerabilities. So we have 10,000 plus customers. We do about 8 billion scans per year. And when we went through all that last year, we found 120 million ransomware related vulnerabilities detected in 2024. So we detected over 783 million of those CISA KEVs, and 120 of those ransomware related vulnerabilities. So that's 15% of all CISA KEVs were detected, were detected are known ransomware vulnerabilities associated with ransomware attacks. And if you do the math, that works out to be about like what, 12,000 ransomware vulnerabilities per customer. I mean, obviously the reality is some have less and some have more, but it's still a profoundly large number when you think about all the customers we're scanning, all the data we're pulling in. It's all been anonymized, but just to know that with all these customers, 120 million vulnerabilities were found that ransomware attackers, if they had the opportunity to, could attack and exploit them, and they'd be on the front page tomorrow.
The number is insane when you look at that. That's so cool that Qualys has that visibility, though, if you think about it, right? Because I mean, we're seeing the trends firsthand, right, within your organization. So that's pretty crazy. So some trends and recommendations. I always like to create these AI generated, oh God, I love AI when you start creating things like this, but that's pretty cool, right? Ransomware. Let's just talk a little bit about key trends and observations that we've seen. So, we talked a little bit about the proliferation of groups. We now have over 75 unique active groups in the ransomware space, which is a lot. And it's evident with them, launching ransomware campaigns with relatively little effort at all, when you're leveraging especially ransomware as a service, or also potentially using services like ChatGPT or AI to even code a piece of ransomware. We're getting to this space now where you can ask an AI agent to essentially code you something, and you got to be a little tricky in how you ask it, because I'm sure it'll say no, we can't do that, but there are some ways around it in circumvention. So you really got to be careful. And I know there's also tools out there on the dark side, or the dark side of the web, unfortunately, where you can ask AI to do these sort of things for you, making it even easier for entities to enter into this particular market. Then we also see this persistence dominance. Those larger groups like RansomHub and Lockbit, they remain dominant because they've shown time and time again that they can, execute on these advanced extortion tactics, and they have been consistent with, either getting the payment up front or, getting a payment out of, a particular target. And so, unfortunately, it's not going to end if they're going to continue to be successful. We are seeing an increased transparency, though. As we have more self-reporting breaches and new regulations coming out. I do think the regulations are good, just so that we are aware of what's going on a day-to-day. It gives us better insight into the threat that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis and how bad it really is. Because if stuff isn't being reported, if we're not aware of ransomware attacks, continuously happening day in and day out, maybe there's not as much of a focus on it or an effort to solve this problem, but it's a problem that does need to be solved. And as I mentioned too earlier, this rise of double and triple extortion, right? With attackers not only relying on encrypting in data, but also stealing it, threatening to leak it, and then also targeting third parties like, customers and partners if they do, get their hands on, that type of information, during their breach. Next slide. This was actually something that John pulled out. This is out of our report in Critical Start, and he's absolutely right. So, from his perspective, he thought this was absolutely fascinating from a psychological perspective. But we also look at trends from a seasonality perspective, a day of the week, a peak attack period. We saw from a seasonal perspective that obviously these attacks skyrocket. 61% of the time during the holiday shopping season, because people are clicking on links if they see a coupon come through, for something at Nordstrom. They're all over it. I know that was maybe a bad example for this particular one. Maybe at a golf store, like Golf Galaxy. If I saw that, I'd be all over it. Maybe I would even click on something like that. But we do see this because people's safeguards are lowered a little bit during those times, right? So those seasonal trends are effective, for those threat actors. And then days of the week, Tuesdays and Fridays emerge as the most active. And if you think about why, you have Patch Tuesday, before a patch actually gets deployed out in the wild to fix a particular vulnerability or a critical security update, there is that window of time that allows those attackers to carry out those objectives and actually exploit a vulnerability. So that makes sense from a Tuesday perspective. And then Friday, of course, this is when security teams are, kind of at the end of their week. They're winding down a lot of times, and maybe they're not as vigilant during that time of the week. I totally get that, right? Friday at 3 p.m., you're kind of ready to go, right? You're almost checked out, but unfortunately you can't be checked out. Cybersecurity is unfortunately a 24/7, 365-day-a-year type job. So having that rotational, SOC organization or ability to always have eyes on glass, regardless of the day of the week, is incredibly important. And then also peak attack periods. What are the most active hours? We saw during 1400, so between 2 and 5 UTC time period. This aligns up with a normal working business day for the threats that are targeting those organizations. When I would work incidents, I would see lulls during their lunchtime. I mean, you could actually definitively see when they stopped PS execing or moving laterally across the environment because they were probably out to lunch. It was 12 p.m. their time. If it was a China-based threat actor. So you start to see those kind of trends and attack periods as you're doing these investigations, and you're building that puzzle of how did they get in, or what did they do while they were in, and what's the timing of that. But it's just something important to note because these are things that we could avoid. This is where we do need to provide those additional eyes during the high periods like Tuesdays and Fridays, or make sure that we have a greater focus in Q4. Next slide.
Yeah, I worked incident response for a while a few years ago too, and Friday afternoon, oh man, that was always the worst when something would pop off. But anyway, so clearly ransomware and the associated vulnerabilities are something we need to pay attention to. And so CISA has issued guidance on ransomware, and the key takeaways here are to, surprise here, but to regularly patch and update your software and operating systems to the latest available versions. Prioritize timely patching, especially for known exploited vulnerabilities. Focus your patching on assets that operate software for processing internet data, such as web browsers, browser plugins, and document readers. And conduct regular vulnerability scanning to identify and address vulnerabilities, especially those on internet-facing devices, to limit that attack surface.
Yeah, I mean, the internet-facing device, unfortunately on those, there's also services like Shodan that actively scan the internet for those types of devices that have those vulnerabilities. So there's tools on the web that enable attackers to be successful too. So that's why it is incredibly important to make sure that you're addressing those externally facing assets. This is really just some ransomware protection recommendations. The first two kind of go hand in hand, implementing a risk-based vulnerability management program that prioritizes remediation based on the exploitability, and also making sure that you're actively patching those items that have been actively exploited out in the wild. I can't stress that more than enough, right? I've seen a third of the cases that I've worked on in an incident response cases, and I've done incident response for, I would say, probably most of my career. I would say 18, 19 years. This is actually the first job where I'm not actually carrying out incident response function. I'm more of out in the field providing, executive level strategic guidance on how do you protect. But, during those 20 years of doing and conducting incident response, that was one of the most critical items, is making sure that we were actively patched, and ensuring that those holes were covered. Ensuring that you have an MDR or SOC team. If you don't have the funds for a full managed section response type service, maybe you only have funds for an internal SOC team or one individual. Even if it's one individual that's has that eyes on glass, you want to make sure that they have that full visibility too across your environment. That you have a tool or capability that's deployed fully and gives you that telemetry that you need in order to identify and isolate and remediate suspicious activity quickly. Requiring MFA. It seems like such an easy thing, but time and time again, a lot of the incidents that I've worked on too, it kind of also led back to them, lacking that particular functionality, lacking that multi-factor authentication. A lot of times it might be like an externally facing RDP server as well, where maybe they just put a username and password on. That's a matter of hours before a threat actor can get into those particular devices. I had that happen one time Christmas morning, unfortunately, with this particular case. It was a prospect that reached out. He wasn't even a customer at the time, but they say, we have a problem. It's Christmas morning and my kids are about to open up their presents. And I'm like, all right, guys, we put a hold on this. And I had to take the call and work an incident all day on Christmas, which is unfortunate, but that's the life we live, as incident responders. But sure enough, we tied it back to that open RDP server that someone had spun up that didn't have the adequate protection in place. Providing ongoing security awareness training. They've got great platforms out there today, that you can leverage. I know that, the Know Before platform is a really great platform, or they've got, items that are built into, various suites and other vendors. I can't actually think of them off the top of my head, but making sure that you have a program in place that actively tests phishing knowledge and sending out fake phishing email messages to see who's clicking on what. I think it's a good training tool, because it helps not only identify individuals who aren't careful, but it also trains them, right? It identifies and highlights those different areas that you need to look for in those phishing emails. And then maintaining immutable and segmented backups that are offline and protected. This is incredibly important. Tabletop exercising and going through your business continuity practice to make sure that it is effective. You don't want to be testing it during a ransomware engagement. A lot of times this is what I see out in the field, but you want to make sure that you're doing those on a regularly scheduled basis. Now, I know a lot of times, those types of things are built into controls like the NIST framework that you are actively testing that, but you want to make sure that you are carrying those out.
Right. And when we talk about, the first thing on there, it was a vulnerability management program, and we talk about patching, and that risk-based vulnerability program, it really can start with somebody like Qualys, for example. And here at Qualys, when we look at the CISA KEVs, our catalog coverage is such that out of those 1,351 CVEs that are known exploitable vulnerabilities, we cover 1,336, amounting to about 98.9% coverage. And our focus is on what matters most. That remaining 1.1% compromises predominantly vulnerabilities in outdated services, off-market or minimal enterprise value products. And the goal here is so that if this pops up in your vulnerability scan, these are prioritized. These are what you go after to remediate, whether it's patching or mitigating them with configuration changes or removing them or isolating them from your network so that that vulnerability is no longer exploitable by those malicious actors. So we set this industry standard with the most comprehensive coverage of CISA KVs. And we found that 20.64% of CVs are for actively exploited network and perimeter devices, and about 20% of these CVs are associated with ransomware. And we kind of talked about that a few slides back. Now, when we talk about uncovering hidden threats across complex environments, we have an approach where, we're able to scan a hybrid environment. Doesn't matter if it's in the cloud, if it's on-prem, it's your laptop, it's your cloud services. Qualys has an ability to reach out and touch all those devices through a variety of different sensors to scan them. I mentioned before that snapshot or API-based scan for those perimeter devices can miss about 25% of the vulnerabilities ransomware actors are able to exploit. But we have flexibility with what we can offer, whether it's agent-based, snapshot-based, SaaS connectors, container sensors. Infrastructure as code scanning, network scans of your infrastructure and your web applications, that API-based scan still, external attack surface management, internet scans like Shodan and more, open source scans for, looking at the different libraries that, JavaScript libraries or others that you might be using in your software, and OT safe scans as well. So it's not just a scanning with different sensors, but we're also complementing it with 25 plus threat intelligence feeds, so that we have a real idea of what what's going on in the world today with these vulnerabilities. Like, how do we know which ones are important and which ones aren't? Well, we know because we leverage what these threat intelligence feeds are seeing in the wild. So we're getting a report from them about what's actively being exploited today. What are the ransomware actors going after? What are those vulnerabilities? And we roll that all together with the assets themselves and the mitigations they may have with them, and if they're internet facing or internal facing, and all that helps us come up with this truest score to help organizations prioritize and fix what really matters most. So it's not just a CVSS score. It's not just a vendor severity score. It's more. We're taking all this threat intelligence and business context to really identify, if you're only going to fix one vulnerability, which is the one you really need to go after first, and work your way through that. So our approach here with this race-based ransomware vulnerability assessment, again, is to prioritize and fix only what reduces risk instead of all the CVEs that you might have on your plate. I think Tim would agree that, if you just tackle, every single higher critical CVESS score that you get, that's not a prioritization approach that works. You're going to essentially have half of all your vulnerabilities are going to fit that definition of higher critical. And so if it's a coin flip, if half your vulnerabilities you have to fix on priority, that's not a scalable approach to managing vulnerabilities. So again, we mapped those key insights with these threat intelligence feeds against these vulnerabilities to really understand what the threat actors themselves are going after, whether it's, there's evidence of POCs or weaponization, or, just there's dark web chatter about these vulnerabilities. And that helps customers to prioritize asset risk due to ransomware based on business criticality and their mitigation controls. So we can help map things such as configuration hardening, compensating controls, and context of asset exposure, like their open ports, what Shodan's telling people, is it a business application or more, and prioritize those ransomware vulnerabilities that are truly causing the risk. And you can see here that we have 279 expertly researched ransomware CVEs and 239 ransomware attack techniques mapped misconfigurations. All right, Tim, this is you.
This is a call to action, everyone, right? So I think it's kind of like a better together story here. So if you're looking for a vulnerability management program, or 365 days a year, 24/7, SOC eyes on glass, Critical Start offers these services as well. We also provide vulnerability management, detection response services. If you don't want to manage your Qualys deployment or your instance, we can take over that entire thing for you, from a services perspective. And also vulnerability prioritization, as John mentioned, because that is absolutely critical, is focusing on the items that matter the most, right? And making sure that those things are being addressed and patched. I never like these webinars to be, vendor pitches, and that's why I typically avoid these at all costs, but this is our pitch, right? So if you want to learn more, feel free, obviously, to reach out to myself or John, or go to criticalstart.com or Qualys to learn more. So final poll question at the end of the day. If you're interested in learning more about Critical Start's MDR or Qualys VM solutions, please answer in the box. While that poll question is up, I can start going through some of the questions. So we actually have a few questions in the chat box. We'll start with number 1. During a ransomware incident, let's say, should end users turn off their PC or unplug from the network? Oh man, this one is a big pet peeve of mine. So yes, it makes sense, right? You'd think immediately, let's shut this thing down. Let's not shut things down. The first thing you should do is unplug from the network so that it can't laterally propagate or connect back out to the command and control infrastructure. But from a forensic analysis perspective, an incident response analyst is going to want their hands on that device, whether that just be the running PC that's active, so they can see how did this particular piece of ransomware get on the machine. Maybe they'll do RAM analysis, memory analysis, to identify what sort of commands executed or where did it come from. There's a lot that can be reconstructed from a forensic perspective if you have the machine still up, active, and running. So shutting things down is a big no-no in my mind, but I would recommend highly disconnecting it from the network. I don't know, John, would you agree? Or
Yeah, from your incident response background, I was going to ask, from a forensic perspective, what are we going to lose data if we power it off? That might help us to understand the attack and where it's coming from. Because I think about, what was it? Not Petya. One of them had in the code itself, the fully qualified domain name is going to reach out to get commands. And some researcher going through this data found it and was able to register that domain because it was still unregistered and stop the bulk of the malware from spreading, or whatever the command and control aspects of it would have been. So I think you also have the fear of losing forensic information that might help you with your response if you just power things out and drop everything out of memory. So I definitely think isolating from the network makes the most sense until you really understand the attack.
Yeah, understanding the attack. I mean, that scenario too with that researcher, it's so unique. That's commonly not, the use case, but that would be a good scenario where, shutting that thing down immediately, so that it couldn't further encrypt files might have made sense at the time, and that when it did beacon out, it would shut down, the encryption process. But that's, I think, kind of a unique story. It's a good story. But yeah, most of the time I would just say you're already owned at that point. If ransomware is starting to encrypt your files, it is rapidly encrypting your files. So I don't think it really matters at that point of kind of retaining any additional information. It's basically you're owned. So that's a really good question. Another question that came across: does Qualys have automatic configuration options so you can do a zero-touch enrollment with or from an MDM like Workspace ONE?
Yeah, Mike, we do have some options there. I can certainly get your information and put you in contact with one of our VM DR mobile users, SMEs, so they can reach out to you and talk to you about your concerns and see what they can do for you.
Good question. I did see in the chat window a question that came across. It wasn't in the question one, but has the advent of relatively cheap LLMs made zero-day vulnerabilities more likely? That's a really well-constructed question. I think that's a good one. I'll start, and then I could pass it over to you, John. I think the answer is yes and no, and let me just explain. So yes, from the perspective that there's this kind of low barrier to entry. You kind of have this script kiddie enablement that allows people to essentially ask whatever they want. Now, of course, there's guardrails in place, but you do have the ability to help generate shell code, parts of shell code. You can even suggest, particular exploit vectors, or, convert between programming language and obfuscate code, or assist in bypassing certain mitigations. There's methods around some of the guardrails that are put up that an individual can take. So I do think it can increase, zero-day vulnerabilities. Why I also think it also can decrease it is skill still does matter. You still need to know what the prompts are and what you're asking. I think having a deep understanding of the OS internals is important, or the memory management, or how you want to construct your shell code. That's important. As I mentioned, these models have safeguards in place and guardrails that they're not going to allow you to necessarily create malware or direct exploit code, but it's still imperfect. There still are ways around it. So that's kind of how I would answer that. I don't know, John, if there's something you want to add there.
Yeah, so we kind of talk internally about the need to patch, and essentially we look at from a disclosure date. On average, it takes about 19 days for a weaponized POC to proliferate across the internet. So, and then most organizations are, if they have like a good integrated patching solution, they're able to patch within 11 days after that. Some organizations take much longer to patch, obviously. So you essentially have 11 days on average where there's a POC out there, and you need to, and before most people patch, right? And so it's all about decreasing that space so that you're patching faster. The problem is as Tim mentioned, people are able to kind of build out these components faster. So what used to take 19 days on average for a weaponized POC to get out there, I think that will start to decrease, because even if the LLM's not building it entirely for them, just writing the shellcode components or something, I think it will decrease the time. And more importantly, it'll probably bring more threat actors to the table trying to do this, because they see that LLMs make it a little bit more accessible to generate code that can do something. So I think that time to weaponization is going to start to decrease, which is going to put more of a challenge on organizations with their patching to decrease that window as well, so that they are keeping abreast with those changes.
Perfect. I don't think we have any other open questions. Crystal, is there anything additional we needed to cover?
No, I think that's all. If we didn't end up answering your questions, we'll be sure to follow up. Tim, John, thank you so much for providing us the session. Any closing remark before I let everybody go?
I just wanted to thank John, for joining this webinar. I love, having someone, side by side when we discuss these types of topics and, just think through, right, a lot of the recommendations that we had within these presentations. It's absolutely critical to avoid becoming, a headline, news from a ransomware perspective. But thank you once again for joining the webinar. John, I'll leave you with the last word.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, scan, assess for vulnerabilities, and remediate those vulnerabilities. Whether you do it with Qualys, we've got the tools to help you out, or you need somebody that has the expertise like Critical Start can provide, take advantage of that. Don't be the next headline, and don't, more importantly, don't have that financial loss where you're down for days because you didn't plan ahead.
That's great.
What John said.
What John said. Yep. Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone. We appreciate it.
everyone. Have a
Thank you,
great
everyone.
day. Take care.
Bye
Bye.
now.
Bye.